Dr. Sarah McKay, welcome. It's such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Sarah, what sparked your fascination with the brain and the passion for the work that you do today?
Oh gosh, it goes back a long way now to my very first year of university. I was in a Psychology 101 lecture, and the lecturer was talking about. So this was in 1993, and the lecturer was kind of giving a lecture on like the biology of psychology. And I'd always done biology and sciences at schools, and I grew up in New Zealand, but certainly high school in New Zealand and biology, there was no topic on the nervous system. I can't even really remember what we talked about DNA, and we talked about evolution, and we talked about plant biology and ecosystems, but we never really looked at the nervous system. And I suppose what we thought then was like the biology of psychology. And the lecturer was talking about neurons and synapses and describing synaptic transmission. And I was just like mind blown. I just thought it was the coolest, most exciting, interesting kind of thing I'd ever really learned about. So much so that I then changed universities because there was a university in New Zealand, Otago University, that had just that year set up a degree program in the discipline of neuroscience, kind of pulling together the neuro of pharmacology and physiology and anatomy and psychology and neurology into one degree. And I was just like, that's it. That's what's really interesting and cool. And all of these years later, I'm still as fascinated and captivated. I think neuroscience, just there's so many levels in which we can kind of approach it, which I really love the zooming in and looking at neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters, and then you can like zoom all the like you can look at with a microscope, and then you can zoom out and kind of look at the brain with your eye, look at brain imaging, perhaps look at cognitive testing, looking at how humans behave and interact with each other. And then you can zoom out even further and look at kind of trends of public health. You can even look at like the whole planet and look to see how brain and behavior and disease risk plays out across parts of the world. So I just love that discipline giving us so many layers and perspectives on humans. And I think selfishly the thing I like right now about it is that other people are really interested, and I just get to talk about it in conversations like this. So I think it's cool, and then I get to tell other people about the cool things I've learned. So it's a really fun occupation for me right now.
Wonderful. And I know as you're talking about the zooming in, one area that you really zoomed in on a lot relates to women.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share with us what are some of the key factors about women neurobiology that you wish you knew years.
Oh gosh. So I spent a good 25 years perhaps in neuroscience research and education and teaching and writing and communicating. And it was only about 10 years ago when I was writing for the ABC here in Australia an article I wrote about brain fog and menopause, which was really the very first time I remember thinking about women's health through that lens of neurobiology and neuroscience. It wasn't part of the cultural conversations. There was a little bit of neuroscience research in there. There's so much in neuroscience. It just hadn't ever occurred to me to think about women's health through that neurobiology lens. And it just kind of blew open this sort of field of research that I had never explored or considered, but was also just beginning to take off. And in those 10 years, so much has changed. I think what I first thought about when I entered this space, looking at women's brain health across the lifespan, I thought a lot of it would be about female hormones, that hormones would kind of be the loudest voice in the crowd. And whilst I had never particularly absorbed or paid attention to conversations around PMS or female hysteria or depression or baby brain or brains are broken, perhaps because my personal experience had always been I've always had good mental health and been reasonably resilient. I hadn't bought into that. But I very much thought when I started exploring this space that it would be about how the brain was shaped by our biology and primarily by our hormones. And what I learned was at every age and every life stage that hormones are just one tiny signal the brain is making meaning of. And perhaps the strongest signal or cue that is meaningful in terms of how someone's well-being, someone's mental health, someone's resilience, someone's overall health as other people, is whether they feel, that they are accepted and loved and seen and trusted, and they're not alone and they're not lonely. Social relationships are actually the strongest predictor of any health outcome at any age and life stage. And I think right now within the women's health space, it's a very much medical, hormonal, biological model, which isn't, the brain isn't paying attention to only that. It is also paying attention to everything in our context and our social world, what's streaming in on this mobile phone device. And then it's consciously and unconsciously making it meaning of all of this information. So I suppose it's not that I was particularly influenced by this model in terms of my own outcomes, but certainly the messages that I feel I've had to counter more than others, or at least wave a flag for as being important, are the social contextual determinants of health when it comes to the brain. Right now, hormones are having their kind of moment in the sun, and that's great, but I don't think brains only pay attention to hormones. So perhaps that's where I would like to see a little bit of a shift, or where perhaps the surprises lie.
So let's dive deeper actually on the social component that you have just brought to the surface as being so essential to our brains. And let's look on the two spectrums that are completely opposite, right? Someone that is maybe experiencing isolation for whatever reason, and someone that is deeply engaged, connected, building meaningful relationships. How are the two brains of those two individuals different as a result of that social interaction?
And perhaps it's more plays out in terms of how people think and feel and behave. And of course, it will very much be layered on top of someone's age and life stage. For example, during adolescence, which is when our brains are they go into kind of a very critical stage of development, where social cognition and learning to read other people's social cues and react and respond and show kind of social behaviors, and kind of extract yourself from your family and have the courage to interact with new people. That part of the brain is undergoing this massive sort of plasticity and sensitivity to social interactions. And so that's why social interactions at that particular life stage are so fundamentally important in terms of health outcomes. So it's not like when someone is lonely or is excluded or is being bullied or perceives themselves as being isolated, that their brain looks different than someone who's engaged. Rather, that brains are very plastic at that point in time. So they become very sort of sensitive to all social interactions, whether they be good or whether they be bad. How much we could see those differences play out in a brain as perhaps structurally down the track is debatable. Rather, it may more so influence patterns of information processing and how networks kind of react and respond. So that sort of age and stage of life is really, really important. We could also kind of dial back to like kind of the earliest sort of stages of postnatal life, like new babies. They can't even regulate their kind of own physiology unless there are other people involved in doing that for them. Babies can't eat, and they can't, regulate their own body temperature and, change themselves. And if they're, tired or uncomfortable, another human is involved fundamentally to manage every aspect of that baby's being. So it's much more important then. There may be different ages and life stages, perhaps when brains and the people who own those brains are more resilient to feeling lonely or being isolated. And I would say that there is a difference, and certainly the literature interrogates these differently, the difference between being socially isolated and feeling lonely, because of course someone could be completely surrounded by people all the time and feel lonely and unseen and excluded, whereas someone could be quite happily in solitude and not be surrounded by people. It's more kind of what happens next. So if someone perceives themselves to be lonely, that has a direct impact on mental health outcomes. That person is far more likely to start experiencing low mood and depression, and they'll isolate themselves more, and that kind of becomes a spiral. And once someone is experiencing depression, they're more vulnerable to other health issues and to experience depression again down the track. And then that just has kind of knock-on, almost snowballing effects in terms of health and well-being. Social isolation may or may not matter if you're not feeling lonely, but potentially if someone is, say you think about someone who's elderly, who's socially isolated, they may not be able to go and buy, healthy food and groceries, or get to the doctor and pick up their medications from the pharmacy, or kind of get help when they need. And so the social isolation, they don't feel lonely, but they may not have the structure and support systems around. There's differences there, and how that plays out, we wouldn't probably see any of these differences play out in brain structure unless it was particularly extreme sort of social deprivation very early in childhood, when the brain's still growing and developing. Rather, we would see it play out in terms of how someone thinks and how someone feels and how someone behaves.
Since you've spoken about babies, and I know one of your books is focus on the baby brain, or what women goes through after having
Yeah.
given birth, what can they expect and how can they best prepare for that?
Yeah, I think there's a really lovely word in use now, which wasn't when I had my boys. My boys are both teenagers. Matrescence, which is very similar to adolescence, in that we recognize becoming a mother as a physiological and, it's a biological, it's a social, it's a almost existential identity shift. And it's also a massive neurological transformation. And it's a process to go through. If I look back and think when my boys were babies and they were very, very young, I think I just kind of thought I wasn't aware that I would change as a person, because we didn't really know anything about the neurological changes of pregnancy and motherhood then. I think I thought, well, it will be difficult because there'll be a whole new human living in my house. It was like, I'll have just this really new small flatmate that will occupy a lot of my time. I didn't realize that my identity would be completely torn to pieces and thrown up, and I'd have to put it back together again. And that part of that is this neurobiology of matrescence. So there's a couple of ways to look at that. We know that pregnancy alters and reorganizes the maternal brain, particularly similar to adolescence, is involved with a lot of reorganization and kind of refining of the brain networks and circuits involved with reading social cues from other people, having empathy, having theory of mind, understanding what other people think and need and want, and then behaving appropriately. And obviously, it's not just everyone else out there in the world. The evolutionary kind of mandate there is because it's this newborn baby that you need to be able to react and respond and, learn very, very quickly how to respond appropriately to their cues. And we know that the brain structural changes that take place during pregnancy, that are driven by pregnancy hormones, reorganize the maternal mind to react and respond to the baby's cues. Now, that feels different in different women. And what is interesting is, for a long time, in lots of different parts of the world, although it's a very cultural story, so it depends on the society you're in, we've got this concept of what I would call baby brain, or mummy brain, they might call it in the US, whereby women feel like forgetful, and both during pregnancy and in early motherhood. I personally never experienced this, but I had never heard of it either. But this idea that you can't your brain isn't working as well as it used to. It's foggy, it's forgetful, you can't kind of do all of the things that you used to be able to do. And long story short, it's not because there's some neurological deficit in your brain as a result of pregnancy. Your brain has shrunk somehow. Rather, your brain has reorganized so that your attention is kind of biologically mandated to focus on your baby. And when you pay attention on one thing to the expense of others, memory depends on what information you take in and what you filter out. So what you would pay attention to and what you exclude from your attention. And when, your entire being is focused on the baby, you can't remember whether you bought bananas or someone's shoes or your husband's, appointment list. There's all of these things that we are excluding because we're focused so much here. But women perceive that as, my brain isn't working properly, when actually your brain is doing what it was kind of reorganized by pregnancy to do, which is to focus in on your baby. So we often talk about these neurological experiences of kind of transformation and reorganization and adaptation as some deficit. But it's not our brains letting us down. It's this massive cognitive load and expectation that the world and also ourselves place to carry on as we used to, almost despite the fact that the baby is there. There's also another interesting phenomenon that we're just sort of starting to describe and understand in a little bit more detail, because many people will be very, very familiar with, keeping an eye on the baby blues and postnatal depression and that kind of the perfect storm that happens postnatally, where you kind of come off all of the high levels of hormones of pregnancy. You've got a new human to look after. You're inevitably sleep deprived. You're recovering from birth. You're figuring out who you are. It's just everything has changed all at once. And without such strong, good social support networks, postnatal depression is a very big risk. But there's also some really interesting research starting to show, and this is, I think, is very useful for many women to understand, that part of that process in those first few postnatal weeks is your nervous system is very, very, very hypervigilant. It's very, very, very kind of wired, and you'll be tired and very wired. And the kind of consequence of our psychology with a nervous system that is very wired is it just starts filling in the gaps. It finds something to kind of worry about. It's like, my nervous system is on edge. I wonder why, and your brain will just kind of fill in the gaps. And what 100% of women almost fills in the gaps with is catastrophic thoughts or intrusive thoughts of something terrible happening to your baby. You'll walk into a room and it will roll down the steps, or you will drop it. And it feels shameful and scary and horrible that so much of your early experiences of motherhood feel like you've got these thoughts that you kind of can't get rid of. They're completely normal. It may even be adaptive in a way that it's like Mother Nature's kind of put this in place so that you do everything you can to keep your baby safe, your worst case scenario, and catastrophize everything while you're learning how to become a mother. We know that typically these intrusive thoughts fade away within maybe sort of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. It's in women that they don't, that they persist, that's a very strong indicator that someone needs help, because that could lead on to clinical anxiety, clinical depression, or something else. To understand that those intrusive thoughts and that feeling of hypervigilance and terror, especially in the first few weeks, are quite normal, I think can be quite reassuring, because I know I thought something terrible was going on with me. I remember very, very clearly being convinced something terrible would happen to my baby. We see it much less in the second time around. It's almost as if we have learned how to become a mother, and your body and your nervous system know how to become a mother, have become a mother too. And you kind of know how to look after a baby, so you don't need to go through the catastrophizing of an overly wired up nervous system, because you kind of know what you're doing the second time around. So that's just something else that I think would be useful for new mums to think about.
Fascinating. And as you're describing these realities that motherhood brings, I kept thinking about the distinct differences that exist between different countries, whereby in certain countries,
For
women end up
sure.
going to back to work literally weeks right
Yes.
after giving birth, while in others, they're home for 12, 18, or even 24 months. Can you
Or
share,
even
or even permanently,
yeah.
indeed, from your research, what have you seen in terms of differentiators, in terms of how basically motherhood shapes us as a human being as a result
Mm,
of returning to work very, very quickly, or taking the time we need to nurture and take care of this beautiful human
yeah.
being that we now have under our care?
Yeah, I think the research is probably quite mixed in terms of longer term women going back or not, because there's lots of kind of drivers. Annoyingly, a lot of the time it's presented by governments as kind of like this economic sort of financial spreadsheet. And it's not kind of taking into account the fact that a baby and a mother and the family are like this biological ecosystem who are all intimately kind of entwined with each other. Clearly and obviously, my own opinion, and I think the research would show that the longer a woman is with her baby, the better, so long as she is also socially supported and financially supported. Obviously, sometimes there's strong economic drivers for women to return to work, but I think it's probably not controversial for me to say that a newborn baby needs its mum, or needs a parent, a primary caregiver, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the biological mother. Obviously, sometimes that's not always the scenario. Some women, and then kind of beyond those first few months and perhaps even year, particularly if that baby's being breastfed and the mum's healthy and well and socially supported, there are lots of drivers as to whether women choose to stay at home or not. And I'm not necessarily sure whether neuroscience has much to add to that, because it depends, I suppose, whether we're looking at women's own health, mental health, well-being, which has multiple influences, or whether we're looking specifically at the baby. But I think it's kind of hard to separate the two. I know for myself personally, and I'm just one person, I made the choice because of the situation we were in, and this is nearly 18 years ago now, to not go back to work at all. In fact, to stay at home with my kids. But that's because we didn't have any family in the city that we were in. And I knew that I didn't want to be checking in and checking out and dropping off and picking up and logging in and logging out, and my kind of life to be kind of lived trying to manage work as well as parenting. I just wanted to do one thing only. And I was like 33 when I had my first son. And I've worked for many years. Financially, we were in the position whereby I didn't have to go back to work. And also I knew sort of socially and support wise that it was just going to be much harder if there wasn't a primary caregiver at home full time. So that was the decision I made. It doesn't mean it was easy or it was always fun. In fact, it was incredibly difficult and sometimes quite isolating. But we're quite lucky because I live in Australia. Certainly, this 18 years ago was a different time, but then as now, there are very strong community support networks, kind of almost government support networks in place for new mothers, whereby you're kind of automatically put into a new mothers kind of coffee group, mothers group within your local kind of community, within your neighborhood. And all the babies kind of born. So April 2008, which was when my son was born, all of the babies born in April 2008 within this particular kind of group of suburbs, we were all invited to join a mothers group under the watchful eye of a kind of the local maternity early childhood nurse for 5 or 6 weeks. And she kind of facilitated us as a group. And then we were kind of sent off into the kind of the wilds ourselves. And so then we stayed together. I mean, I still catch up with some of those mothers now. We had, this kind of support group created for us. And that's an Australian government kind of, there's something similar happens in New Zealand. So you'd have to kind of opt out of that. So there's different, like you say, different parts of the world have different scenarios in place. The suburb in which I was living, and none of this is really neuroscience, just a bit of a personal anecdote. The suburb I was living in was a reasonably wealthy suburb, and lots of the women were older, and lots of us didn't grow up in Australia. Some did, but not all. So most of our husbands, and we were still, everyone was happily married at that point. Husbands had great jobs. So lots of us didn't go back to work. So we kind of all didn't, just spent 5 or 6 years together every single week. And then, the siblings kind of came along. So it's a really interesting model. And that was certainly my experience of motherhood. I was in no rush to juggle all of the balls. And I was also quite determined because I had a really lovely, calm, happy, safe, secure childhood. I wanted to give that to my boys. Even in the absence of extended family around, I decided that was what I wanted to do, and it worked for me. But there were forces that enabled that. Not everyone has that choice. I understand that. Can't say it was always easy, but I think easier than it would have been if I had rushed back to the workplace to balance kind of a financial spreadsheet.
Thank you so much for sharing. You and the kids are very, very lucky to have had the chance to share those beautiful years
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, it was a real blessing for us all.
And as we've evolved through the ages, we spoke about the earlier years, now motherhood. As we're evolving through our life beyond 35, 40s, entering perimenopause, menopause, what can you share with our audience about those cycles and what happens at the level of the brain that our listeners should be aware of?
Yeah, I think we're just starting to understand a little bit more about this kind of next reproductive life transition. So we have puberty and adolescence, and then we have pregnancy and motherhood, and then we've got, perimenopause and menopause. I think in many ways, whilst some women struggle through these life transitions because it's a social shift or a self-identity shift or a biological shift or a hormonal shift, our brains always adapt and flex and respond to kind of the context we're in and the biological shifts. Men kind of don't have as many opportunities to kind of put themselves in a state of plasticity and adapt and react and respond, which I think is kind of interesting. I think some women sort of sail through the perimenopause and menopause and come out the other side, and perhaps they're not hormonally sensitive, or they're very fit and well, or have low levels of stress or good social support networks. Some women sail through, other women kind of perhaps might experience some symptoms and other women are completely like kind of sidelined or flattened by the experience. In terms of our brain, there's a lot going on, and I'm going to try and be as concise as I can be because I'm very long-winded. We understand that as estrogen and progesterone levels roller coaster and then flatline, that kind of is is kind of a neurological transition that the brain is going through. The brain is shifting and responding both in terms of structure, although the studies on brain structure aren't really very clear yet. The clearest scenario that we understand is the changes in the hypothalamus, whereby the roller coastering hormones narrow the hypothalamic thermostat, which regulates body temperature, and the vasomotor symptoms, or the hot flashes and night sweats and disrupted sleep that lots of women experience, are a direct consequence of the declining levels of hormones, because we know if we supplement the hormones back in with hormone therapy, we can kind of reset the thermostat. And that kind of brings back up a few dominoes. Not all of them. Perhaps it depends on how many dominoes fell or how impactful it was. And that's kind of might almost be the starting point. Although that again is controversial. If you are having hot sweats and vasomotor episodes, that's constantly activating your sympathetic nervous system, which makes you feel a bit more wired. If it's waking you up constantly at night, it's making you feel wired and tired. So you become more hypervigilant. So you're more likely to experience anxiety. Women who have prior experiences of depression, or perhaps had PMS, or perhaps had postnatal depression, are also more vulnerable to experience depression during this time. And if you kind of got all of these things happening at once, or even if it's just sleep disruption, you're also perhaps susceptible to experience what some women call brain fog, although we haven't really got a clear clinical definition and measure of brain fog yet, but lots of women have trouble with verbal recall, etc. But often once you kind of get out the other side, things sort of stabilize, the brain adapts, everything kind of settles down a little bit. And in some women, you know, they kind of come out the other side and things sort of stabilize and normalize. It's just this process of brain adaptation. I think what's interesting, though, to think about is, because for a long time I couldn't kind of make sense in my mind, why does it take the brain so long? Like, why do some women have hot flashes for 10 years? Why doesn't the brain is plastic and can adapt and respond? Why doesn't it just quickly adapt and respond to changing levels of hormones and vasomotor symptoms? And I guess if you think about evolution, it's driven by reproduction, and this is a post-reproductive event. So there's no kind of evolutionary mandate to select or not select for that, because you've already had your baby. So at that point, it doesn't matter, which is why it may persist so long. It's just almost kind of like a appendage of evolution. So, you know, it's kind of up to us, I suppose, to be able to react and manage that. Something else that's kind of happening as you go across your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s is you're just getting older, right? It's not a decline. We have all of this new research coming out that's looking at a whole lot of different kinds of measures of cognition and how brains think and react and respond. And we've so much focus in on what you kind of peak at in your early 20s, which is like working memory and fluid intelligence and quick problem solving, you know, being presented with a new problem and being able to come up with a quick solution to it, which we kind of all peak at in our 20s. And then that ability does slowly kind of decline during life. But there's so many other things which increase. If you go through motherhood, you have greater empathy and greater theory of mind. In your career, you're gaining more experience and more wisdom and more strategy and more judgment. And processing speed may slow down, but slow thinking is not necessarily bad. It can mean you are more strategic and you have more wisdom. And it maybe this is adaptive. Maybe the second half of life isn't about building and growing and creating and building a career and building a family and establishing yourself. Maybe it is the time to be, if you're a woman, a matriarch, to be a teacher, to be a nurturer, to be imparting knowledge and wisdom. You've passed your reproductive years. And so now is the time to kind of think about, you've built up all of this knowledge, how can you impart it? And maybe slower thinking is kind of part of that. Maybe I'm just putting a positive spin on it, who knows? But I think we have this very strong tendency in the cultural narrative right now to, people don't like it when people say the word catastrophize around menopause, because for lots of women it does absolutely completely flatline them. But there's lots of positivities and lots of trajectories and lots of different ways we can look at talking about midlife that aren't just about dealing with the symptoms of menopause. there's trajectories through the lifespan, and I feel like sometimes we're not necessarily also including the positivity. Some of the conversations are going straight down the line of creating gendered ageism, which I think is a bit concerning. But it's an interesting moment in time culturally right now.
I fully agree, and one of the key factors that I keep hearing about is how women across various research studies indicate that they have double the risk of developing dementia in comparison to men. And to remain on a positive note, what advice would you have for our listeners that actually want to protect and sharpen and elevate their brain health with the idea of potentially preventing dementia?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of actions that we can take to reduce our risk. I mean, you could never smoke and still get lung cancer, so there's never any absolutes. The data on males versus females is interesting because that kind of ratio, grows and expands and contracts in different countries around the world over different kind of age cohorts, which I think is interesting because if it was purely driven by menopausal biology, we wouldn't see that kind of gap shift and shape and change over time because there are so many factors that contribute to that risk. We've got it different, and I always like to talk about statistics. People's brains sort of switch off. But I often so we've got like this pool of people we call prevalence that everyone with a disease, with Alzheimer's disease, is sort of swimming around in. And as they die, that's mortality. They flow out of the plug hole. But then we've also got the inflow, which is incidence. In healthy, wealthy countries like, Northern Europe, Australia, where I live, the incidence, the inflow is actually slowing down in many parts of the world. And that's because we're getting better at treating some of the diseases that are risk factors for dementia, like cardiovascular risk, poor metabolic health. We're getting better at treating that. So the kind of inflow is slowing down, but the pool is still growing because not as many people are going out the plug hole, and people are also getting older, so they're just staying in the prevalence pool for longer before they flow out the plug hole. And men tend to flow out the plug hole younger than women, and so we've got very many contributing factors to there be more women swimming in the prevalence pool. So we've got to look at the incidence, we've got to look at mortality, and we've got to look at aging and all of the factors which are contributing to all of this. It's not just menopause and not just female hormones. It's your entire reproductive lifespan. It goes all the way back to early childhood in terms of the amount of education you've had. The more formal education, the more years of formal education you have, the kind of greater cognitive resilience that you build in. So you've kind of got lower to, you'll still decline if you develop dementia, but you're sort of starting from a higher level. So you won't kind of reach it'll take longer to reach lower levels. So we've got, early childhood education, we've got depression, I think we fail to pay any attention to sensory inputs. So we know that untreated hearing loss and untreated vision loss are enormous risk factors for going on to develop dementia, because if you can't see and you can't hear, you withdraw from the world and your brain isn't interacting and being stimulated and taking part in the world. And so it kind of almost shuts in on itself. So there's so many different things we can do. But I think it depends on the age you are. Obviously, early childhood education may not be something you can do anything about if you're 50, but at this point in time you can take care of your cardiovascular health, and there's nothing really new there under the sun. It's around healthy diet, it's around exercise, it's around stress reduction, it's around making sure you sleep. If you've got unmanaged high blood pressure or high LDL cholesterol, all of these are all factors that we can treat, and we know by treating them, that's what's been slowing that the trickle in, the inflow into the prevalence later in life. Try and avoid depression if you can, or treat depression. Try and avoid head injuries if you can. Some factors like air pollution are a bit hard, like as an individual, to kind of manage and cope with. But there's plenty that we can do. That said, there's also often feels like there's nothing new under the sun. We don't have some magic kind of bullet yet. We don't have any good evidence one way or another as to whether menopause hormone therapy I always think about risk as being like, a set of like those old balance scales. You've got risks on one side and kind of protective factors on the other, and you just kind of want to tip it in your favor. For menopause hormone therapy, we've got some studies that are putting the weight on the risk side and others putting it on the benefit side. And we don't quite know how big and heavy that weight is yet. So at the moment, we can't really give anyone advice about that. So the menopause hormone therapy dementia space is quite mixed right now, but the clinical practice guidelines are up to date on that and don't recommend it be taken to prevent dementia. So I think just that overall kind of healthy lifestyle approach, which is like kind of pretty boring, to be perfectly honest, the stuff that you would have heard 100 times before. Our brains are not like this kind of separate entity from the rest of our bodies. You know, the health of every cell in our body includes the health of every cell in our brain. It's not like a separate kind of entity here. It's just we can also intellectually stimulate it, and keep on using it and engaging it and challenging it, I think is important.
From all your research in neuroscience, what do you believe is essential for an individual to really have that life vitality and joyful spirit? And if there would actually be a recipe for joy, what would be the three main ingredients in your view?
I read something recently about how, this for a long time we were really concerned about lifespan and increasing lifespan. And then we've started talking about health span, and we want to, our health span and our lifespan to match up. And then I heard someone recently had written a book about joy span, because I often feel like, especially within the kind of the science bros world of longevity hacks and biohacking and trying to live as long as possible, there doesn't seem to be much joy involved in that at all. It's like everyone's desperately trying to hang on as long as possible, and they don't seem to be having a lot of fun along the way. So I sometimes think that the world of well-being can be so earnest and sanctimonious that there's no space for joy. That doesn't mean you can only have joy if you're being unhealthy, but sometimes think it would be nice if they could crack open a little can of joy every now and then. Right now, I'm in a bit of a situation where, I've just playing, just my current personal sort of scenario the last few days and weeks is that, like, when you're a mum, you're only happy as your unhappiest child. And that again just goes straight to the heart of social relationships being this sort of the greatest source of comfort and joy and nurture and optimism, but also can be the greatest source of pain. And I think that, I don't know whether there's multiple recipes for joy, but just one, that it's about other people, and that can just be like such the joy, but it can be so much pain as well. And I think it's just about other people is the recipe there, but sometimes other people can be really mean. So yeah, that's just a little scenario I'm navigating right now.
If you could leave our listeners with one science-based truth to live by, what would it be?
I think everything falls apart if you don't have a good night's sleep. We know what it feels like if we have one night of disrupted sleep or broken sleep. And if it's weeks or months or years, your risk of every disease increases. Your risk of mental health problems, your risk of dementia down the track, because sleeping kind of helps to clear out kind of the metabolites that have built up in the brain during the day. It's a reset. It's a consolidation of the life experiences and memories that you've gathered up during the day. It's essential because we almost have no choice but to do it for a third of the day. And people who don't sleep well or struggle sleeping, it's not like they're just kind of carrying on being completely fine about that. So it's an evolutionary mandate for us, from cellular health through to kind of long-term brain aging and mental health. So it just has fingers into every aspect of our lives. And I think if you can get sleep sorted, and that may be easier or less easy for different people depending on their circumstances, then all of the other pieces are easier to build upon.
On those beautiful words, Sarah, thank you so much for everything you have shared today. It's been an immense pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you.